The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 2, Side 2. With the coming of a settled agricultural life, unions became more permanent. Under the patriarchal system, the man found it uneconomical to divorce a wife, for this meant in effect to lose a profitable slave. As the family became the productive unit of society, tilling the soil together, it prospered, other things equal, according to its size and cohesion. It was found to some advantage that the union of the mates should continue until the last child was reared. By that time no energy remained for a new romance, and the lives of the parents had been forged into one by common work and trials. Only with the passage to urban industry and the consequent reduction of the family in size and economic importance has divorce become widespread again. In general, throughout history, men have wanted many children, and therefore have called motherhood sacred, while women who know more about reproduction have secretly rebelled against this heavy assignment and have used an endless variety of means to reduce the burdens of maternity. Primitive men do not usually care to restrict population. Under normal conditions, children are profitable, and the male regrets only that they cannot all be sons. It is the woman who invents abortion, infanticide, and contraception, for even the last occurs sporadically among primitive peoples. It is astonishing to find how similar are the motives of the savage to the civilized woman in preventing birth: to escape the burden of rearing offspring, to preserve a youthful figure, to avert the disgrace of extramarital motherhood, to avoid death, etc. The simplest means of reducing maternity was the refusal of the man by the woman during the period of nursing, which might be prolonged for many years. Sometimes, as among the Cheyenne Indians, the women developed the custom of refusing to bear a second child until the first was 10 years old. In New Britain, the women had no children till 2 or 4 years after marriage. The Guaicurus of Brazil were constantly diminishing because the women would bear no children till the age of 30. Among the Papuans, abortion was frequent. "Children are burdensome," said the women. "We are weary of them. We go dead." Some Maori tribes used herbs or induced artificial malposition of the uterus to prevent conception. When abortion failed, infanticide remained. Most nature peoples permitted the killing of the newborn child if it was deformed or diseased or a bastard, or if its mother had died in giving it birth. As if any reason would be good in the task of limiting population to the available means of subsistence, many tribes killed infants whom they considered to have been born under unlucky circumstances. So the Bombay natives strangled all children who entered the world head first. The Kamchados killed babes born in stormy weather. Madagascar tribes exposed, drowned, or buried alive children who made their debut in March or April, or on a Wednesday or a Friday, or in the last week of the month. If a woman gave birth to twins, it was, in some tribes, held proof of adultery, since no man could be the father of 2 children at the same time, and therefore one or both of the children suffered death. The practice of infanticide was particularly prevalent among nomads, who found children a problem on their long marches. The Bangarang tribe of Victoria killed half their children at birth. The Lenguas of the Paraguayan Chaco allowed only 1 child per family per 7 years to survive. The Abaponis achieved a French economy and population by rearing a boy and a girl in each household, killing off other offspring as fast as they appeared. Where famine conditions existed or threatened, most tribes strangled the newborn, and some tribes ate them. Usually it was the girl that was most subject to infanticide. Occasionally she was tortured to death with the view to inducing the soul to appear, in its next incarnation, in the form of a boy. Infanticide was practiced without cruelty and without remorse, for in the first moments after delivery, apparently, the mother felt no instinctive love for the child. Once the child had been permitted to live a few days, it was safe against infanticide. Soon parental love was evoked by its helpless simplicity, and in most cases it was treated more affectionately by its primitive parents than the average child of the higher races. For lack of milk or soft food, the mother nursed the child from 2 to 4 years, sometimes for 12. One traveler describes a boy who had learned to smoke before he was weaned, and often a youngster running about with other children would interrupt his play or his work to go and be nursed by his mother. The Negro mother at work carried her infant on her back and sometimes fed it by slinging her breasts over her shoulder. Primitive discipline was indulgent but not ruinous. At an early age, the child was left to face for itself the consequences of its stupidity, its insolence, or its pugnacity, and learning went on apace. Filial as well as parental love was highly developed in natural society. Dangers and disease were frequent in primitive childhood, and mortality was high. Youth was brief, for at an early age marital and martial responsibility began, and soon the individual was lost in the heavy tasks of replenishing and defending the group. The women were consumed in caring for children, the men in providing for them. When the youngest child had been reared, the parents were worn out. As little space remained for individual life at the end as at the beginning. Individualism, like liberty, is a luxury of civilization. Only with the dawn of history were a sufficient number of men and women freed from the burdens of hunger, reproduction, and war to create the intangible values of leisure, culture, and art. 3. Social morality. The nature of virtue and vice, greed, dishonesty, violence, homicide, suicide, the socialization of the individual, altruism, hospitality, manners, tribal limits of morality, primitive versus modern morals, religion and morals. Part of the function of parentage is the transmission of a moral code. For the child is more animal than human. It has humanity thrust upon it day by day as it receives the moral and mental heritage of the race. Biologically, it is badly equipped for civilization, since its instincts provide only for traditional and basic situations, and include impulses more adapted to the jungle than to the town. Every vice was once a virtue, necessary in the struggle for existence. It became a vice only when it survived the conditions that made it indispensable. A vice, therefore, is not an advanced form of behavior, but usually an atavistic throwback to ancient and superseded ways. It is one purpose of a moral code to adjust the unchanged or slowly changing impulses of human nature to the changing needs and circumstances of social life. Greed, acquisitiveness, dishonesty, cruelty, and violence were for so many generations useful to animals and men that not all our laws, our education, our morals, and our religions can quite stamp them out. Some of them doubtless have a certain survival value even today. The animal gorges himself because he does not know when he may find food again. This uncertainty is the origin of greed. The Yakuts have been known to eat 40 pounds of meat in one day, and similar stories, only less heroic, are told of the Eskimos and the natives of Australia. Economic security is too recent an achievement of civilization to have eliminated this natural greed. It still appears in the insatiable acquisitiveness whereby the fretful modern man or woman stores up gold or other goods that may, in emergency, be turned into food. Greed for drink is not as widespread as greed for food, for most human aggregations have centered around some water supply. Nevertheless, the drinking of intoxicants is almost universal, not so much because men are greedy as because they are cold and wish to be warmed, or unhappy and wish to forget, or simply because the water available to them is not fit to drink. Dishonesty is not so ancient as greed, for hunger is older than property. The simplest savages seem to be the most honest. Their word is sacred, said Colvin of the Hottentots. They know nothing of the corruptness and faithless arts of Europe. As international communications improved, this naive honesty disappeared. Europe has taught the gentle art to the Hottentots. In general, dishonesty rises with civilization, because under civilization the stakes of diplomacy are larger, there are more things to be stolen, and education makes men clever. When property develops among primitive men, lying and stealing come in its train. Crimes of violence are as old as greed. The struggle for food, land, and mates has in every generation fed the earth with blood, and has offered a dark background for the fitful light of civilization. Primitive man was cruel because he had to be. Life taught him that he must have an arm always ready to strike, and a heart apt for natural killing. The blackest page in anthropology is the story of primitive torture, and of the joy that many primitive men and women seem to have taken in the infliction of pain. Much of this cruelty was associated with war. Within the tribe, manners were less ferocious, and primitive men treated one another, and even their slaves, with a quite civilized kindliness. But since men had to kill vigorously in war, they learned to kill also in time of peace, for to many a primitive mind no argument is settled until one of the disputants is dead. Among many tribes, murder, even of another member of the same clan, aroused far less horror than it used to do with us. The Fuegians punished a murderer merely by exiling him until his fellows had forgotten his crime. The Kaffirs considered a murderer unclean, and required that he should blacken his face with charcoal, but after a while, if he washed himself, rinsed his mouth, and dyed himself brown, he was received into society again. The savages of Futuna, like our own, looked upon a murderer as a hero. In several tribes, no woman would marry a man who had not killed someone in fair fight or foul, hence the practice of headhunting which survives in the Philippines today. The Dayak who brought back most heads from such a manhunt had the choice of all the girls in his village. These were eager for his favors, feeling that through him they might become the mothers of brave and potent men. Where food is dear, life is cheap. Eskimo sons must kill their parents when these have become so old as to be helpless and useless. Failure to kill them in such cases would be considered a breach of filial duty. Even his own life seems cheap to primitive man, for he kills himself with a readiness rivaled only by the Japanese. If an offended person commits suicide or mutilates himself, the offender must imitate him or become a pariah. So old is harakiri. Any reason may suffice for suicide. Some Indian women of North America killed themselves because their men had assumed the privilege of scolding them, and a young Trobriand islander committed suicide because his wife had smoked all his tobacco. To transmute greed into thrift, violence into argument, murder into litigation, and suicide into philosophy has been part of the task of civilization. It was a great advance when the strong consented to eat the weak by due process of law. No society can survive if it allows its members to behave toward one another in the same way in which it encourages them to behave as a group toward other groups. Internal cooperation is the first law of external competition. The struggle for existence is not ended by mutual aid. It is incorporated or transferred to the group. Other things equal, the ability to compete with rival groups will be proportionate to the ability of the individual members and families to combine with one another. Hence, every society inculcates a moral code and builds up in the heart of the individual, as its secret allies and aids, social dispositions that mitigate the natural war of life. It encourages, by calling them virtues, those qualities or habits in the individual which redound to the advantage of the group, and discourages contrary qualities by calling them vices. In this way, the individual is in some outward measure socialized, and the animal becomes a citizen. It was hardly more difficult to generate social sentiments in the soul of the savage than it is to raise them now in the heart of modern man. The struggle for life encouraged communalism, but the struggle for property intensifies individualism. Primitive man was perhaps readier than contemporary man to cooperate with his fellows. Social solidarity came more easily to him since he had more perils and interests in common with his group, and less possessions to separate him from the rest. The natural man was violent and greedy, but he was also kindly and generous, ready to share even with strangers and to make presents to his guests. Every schoolboy knows that primitive hospitality in many tribes went to the extent of offering to the traveler the wife or daughter of the host. To decline such an offer was a serious offense, not only to the host but to the woman. These are among the perils faced by missionaries. Often the later treatment of the guest was determined by the manner in which he had acquitted himself of these responsibilities. Uncivilized man appears to have felt proprietary but not sexual jealousy. It did not disturb him that his wife had known men before marrying him or now slept with his guest, but as her owner rather than her lover he would have been incensed to find her cohabiting with another man without his consent. Some African husbands lent their wives to strangers for a consideration. The rules of courtesy were as complex in most simple peoples as in advanced nations. Each group had formal modes of salutation and farewell. Two individuals on meeting rubbed noses or smelled each other or gently bit each other. As we have seen, they never kissed. Some crude tribes were more polite than the modern average. The Dayak headhunters, we are told, were gentle and peaceful in their home life, and the Indians of Central America considered the loud talking and brusque behavior of the white man as signs of poor breeding and a primitive culture. Almost all groups agree in holding other groups to be inferior to themselves. The American Indians looked upon themselves as the chosen people, specially created by the Great Spirit as an uplifting example for mankind. One Indian tribe called itself the Only Men. Another called itself Men of Men. The Caribs said, "We alone are people." The Eskimos believed that the Europeans had come to Greenland to learn manners and virtues. Consequently, it seldom occurred to primitive man to extend to other tribes the moral restraints which he acknowledged in dealing with his own. He frankly conceived it to be the function of morals to give strength and coherence to his group against other groups. Commandments and taboos applied only to the people of his tribe. With others, except when they were his guests, he might go as far as he dared. Moral progress in history lies not so much in the improvement of the moral code as in the enlargement of the area within which it is applied. The morals of modern man are not unquestionably superior to those of primitive man, although the two groups of codes may differ considerably in content, practice, and profession. But modern morals are in normal times extended, though with decreasing intensity, to a greater number of people than before. As tribes were gathered up into those larger units called states, morality overflowed its tribal bounds, and as communication, or a common danger, united and assimilated states, morals seeped through frontiers, and some men began to apply their commandments to all Europeans, to all whites, at last to all men. Perhaps there have always been idealists who wished to love all men as their neighbors, and perhaps in every generation they have been futile voices crying in a wilderness of nationalism and war. But probably the number, even the relative number, of such men has increased. There are no morals in diplomacy, and la politique n'a pas d'entrailles. But there are morals in international trade, merely because such trade cannot go on without some degree of restraint, regulation, and confidence. Trade began in piracy. It culminates in morality. Few societies have been content to rest their moral codes upon so frankly rational a basis as economic and political utility. For the individual is not endowed by nature with any disposition to subordinate his personal interests to those of the group, or to obey irksome regulations for which there are no visible means of enforcement. To provide, so to speak, an invisible watchman, to strengthen the social impulses against the individualistic by powerful hopes and fears, societies have not invented but made use of religion. The ancient geographer Strabo expressed the most advanced views on this subject 1900 years ago. For in dealing with a crowd of women, at least, or with any promiscuous mob, a philosopher cannot influence them by reason or exhort them to reverence, piety, and faith. Nay, there is need of religious fear also, and this cannot be aroused without myths and marvels. For thunderbolt, aegis, trident, torches, snakes, thyrsus lances, arms of the gods, are myths, and so is the entire ancient theology. But the founders of states gave their sanction to these things as bugbears wherewithal to scare the simple-minded. Now, since this is the nature of mythology, and since it has come to have its place in the social and civil scheme of life as well as in the history of actual facts, the ancients clung to their system of education for children and applied it up to the age of maturity, and by means of poetry they believed that they could satisfactorily discipline every period of life. But now, after a long time, the writing of history and the present-day philosophy have come to the front. Philosophy, however, is for the few, whereas poetry is more useful to the people at large. Morals, then, are soon endowed with religious sanctions because mystery and supernaturalism lend a weight which can never attach to things empirically known and genetically understood. Men are more easily ruled by imagination than by science. But was this moral utility the source or origin of religion? 4. Religion. Primitive atheists. If we define religion as the worship of supernatural forces, we must observe at the outset that some peoples have apparently no religion at all. Certain pygmy tribes of Africa have no observable cult or rites. They had no totem, no fetishes, and no gods. They buried their dead without ceremony and seem to have paid no further attention to them. They lacked even superstitions, if we may believe otherwise incredible travelers. The dwarfs of the Cameroon recognized only malevolent deities and did nothing to placate them on the ground that it was useless to try. The Vedas of Ceylon went no further than to admit the possibility of gods and immortal souls, but they offered no prayers or sacrifices. Asked about God, they answered, as puzzled as the latest philosopher, "Is he on a rock? On a white ant hill? On a tree? I never saw a god." The North American Indians conceived a god, but did not worship him. Like Epicurus, they thought him too remote to be concerned in their affairs. An Aberpony Indian rebuffed a metaphysical inquirer in a manner quite Confucian. "Our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers were wont to contemplate the earth alone, solicitous only to see whether the plain afford grass and water for their horses. They never troubled themselves about what went on in the heavens, and who was the creator and governor of the stars." The Eskimos, when asked who had made the heavens and the earth, always replied, "We do not know." A Zulu was asked, "When you see the sun rising and setting and the trees growing, do you know who made them and governs them?" He answered simply, "No, we see them, but cannot tell how they came. We suppose that they came by themselves." Such cases are exceptional, and the old belief that religion is universal is substantially correct. To the philosopher, this is one of the outstanding facts of history and psychology. He is not content to know that all religions contain much nonsense, but rather he is fascinated by the problem of the antiquity and persistence of belief. What are the sources of the indestructible piety of mankind? 1. The sources of religion. Fear, wonder, dreams, the soul, animism. Fear, as Lucretius said, was the first mother of the gods. Fear, above all, of death. Primitive life was beset with 1,000 dangers, and seldom ended with natural decay. Long before old age could come, violence or some strange disease carried off the great majority of men. Hence early man did not believe that death was ever natural. He attributed it to the operation of supernatural agencies. In the mythology of the natives of New Britain, death came to men by an error of the gods. The good god Kambinana told his foolish brother Korvuva, "Go down to men and tell them to cast their skins. So shall they avoid death. But tell the serpents that they must henceforth die." Korvuva mixed the messages. He delivered the secret of immortality to the snakes and the doom of death to men. Many tribes thought that death was due to the shrinkage of the skin, and that man would be immortal if only he could molt. Fear of death, wonder at the causes of chance events or unintelligible happenings, hope for divine aid and gratitude for good fortune, cooperated to generate religious belief. Wonder and mystery adhered particularly to sex and dreams, and the mysterious influence of heavenly bodies upon the earth and man. Primitive man marveled at the phantoms that he saw in sleep, and was struck with terror when he beheld in his dreams the figures of those whom he knew to be dead. He buried his dead in the earth to prevent their return. He buried victuals and goods with the corpse, lest it should come back to curse him. Sometimes he left to the dead the house in which death had come, while he himself moved on to another shelter. In some places he carried the body out of the house not through a door, but through a hole in the wall, and bore it rapidly 3 times around the dwelling so that the spirit might forget the entrance and never haunt the home. Such experiences convinced early man that every living thing had a soul or secret life within it, which could be separated from the body in illness, sleep, or death. "Let no one wake a man brusquely," said one of the Upanishads of ancient India, "for it is a matter difficult of cure if the soul find not its way back to him." Not man alone, but all things had souls. The external world was not insensitive or dead, it was intensely alive. If this were not so, thought primitive philosophy, nature would be full of inexplicable occurrences, like the motion of the sun, or the death-dealing lightning, or the whispering of the trees. The personal way of conceiving objects and events preceded the impersonal or abstract. Religion preceded philosophy. Such animism is the poetry of religion, and the religion of poetry. We may see it at its lowest in the wonder-struck eyes of a dog that watches a paper blown before him by the wind, and perhaps believes that a spirit moves the paper from within. And we find the same feeling at its highest in the language of the poet. To the primitive mind, and to the poet in all ages, mountains, rivers, rocks, trees, stars, sun, moon, and sky are sacramentally holy things, because they are the outward and visible signs of inward and invisible souls. To the early Greeks, the sky was the god Uranus, the moon was Selene, the earth was Gaia, the sea was Poseidon, and everywhere in the woods was Pan. To the ancient Germans, the forest primeval was peopled with genii, elves, trolls, giants, dwarfs, and fairies. These sylvan creatures survive in the music of Wagner and the poetic dramas of Ibsen. The simpler peasants of Ireland still believe in fairies, and no poet or playwright can belong to the Irish literary revival unless he employs them. There is wisdom as well as beauty in this animism. It is good and nourishing to treat all things as alive. To the sensitive spirit, as the most sensitive of contemporary writers, nature begins to present herself as a vast congeries of separate living entities, some visible, some invisible, but all possessed of mind stuff, all possessed of matter stuff, and all blending mind and matter together in the basic mystery of being. The world is full of gods. From every planet and from every stone there emanates a presence that disturbs us with a sense of the multitudinousness of godlike powers, strong and feeble, great and little, moving between heaven and earth upon their secret purposes. 2. The objects of religion: the sun, the stars, the earth, sex, animals, totemism, the transition to human gods, ghost worship, ancestor worship. Since all things have souls or contain hidden gods, the objects of religious worship are numberless. They fall into 6 classes: celestial, terrestrial, sexual, animal, human, and divine. Of course, we shall never know which of our universe of objects was worshipped first. One of the first was probably the moon. Just as our own folklore speaks of the man in the moon, so primitive legend conceived the moon as a bold male who caused women to menstruate by seducing them. He was a favorite god with women, who worshipped him as their protecting deity. The pale orb was also the measure of time. It was believed to control the weather and to make both rain and snow. Even the frogs prayed to it for rain. We do not know when the sun replaced the moon as the lord of the sky in primitive religion. Perhaps it was when vegetation replaced hunting, and the transit of the sun determined the seasons of sowing and reaping, and its heat was recognized as the main cause of the bounty of the soil. Then the earth became a goddess fertilized by the hot rays, and men worshipped the great orb as the father of all things living. From this simple beginning, sun worship passed down into the pagan faiths of antiquity, and many a later god was only a personification of the sun. Anaxagoras was exiled by the learned Greeks because he ventured the guess that the sun was not a god, but merely a ball of fire, about the size of the Peloponnesus. The Middle Ages kept a relic of sun worship in the halo pictured around the heads of saints, and in our own day the Emperor of Japan is regarded by most of his people as an incarnation of the sun god. There is hardly any superstition so old but it can be found flourishing somewhere today. Civilization is the precarious labor and luxury of a minority. The basic masses of mankind hardly change from millennium to millennium. Like the sun and the moon, every star contained or was a god, and moved at the command of its indwelling spirit. Under Christianity, these spirits became guiding angels, star pilots, so to speak, and Kepler was not too scientific to believe in them. The sun itself was a great god, worshipped devoutly as giver and withholder of rain. Among many primitive peoples, the word for god meant sky. Among the Lubari and the Dinkas, it meant rain. Among the Mongols, the supreme god was Tengri, the sky. In China, it was Ti, the sky. In Vedic India, it was Dyaus-Pitar, the father sky. Among the Greeks, it was Zeus, the sky, the cloud compeller. Among the Persians, it was Ahura, the azure sky. And among ourselves, men still ask heaven to protect them. The central point in most primitive mythology is the fertile mating of earth and sky. For the earth, too, was a god, and every main aspect of it was presided over by some deity. Trees had souls quite as much as men, and it was plain murder to cut them down. The North American Indians sometimes attributed their defeat and decay to the fact that the whites had leveled the trees whose spirits had protected the red men. In the Molucca Islands, blossoming trees were treated as pregnant. No noise, fire, or other disturbance was permitted to mar their peace. Else, like a frightened woman, they might drop their fruit before time. In Amboina, no loud sounds were allowed near the rice in bloom, lest it should abort into straw. The ancient Gauls worshipped the trees of certain sacred forests, and the Druid priests of England reverenced as holy that mistletoe of the oak, which still suggests a pleasant ritual. The veneration of trees, springs, rivers, and mountains is the oldest traceable religion of Asia. Many mountains were holy places, homes of thundering gods. Earthquakes were the shoulder-shrugging of irked or irate deities. The Fijians ascribed such agitations to the earth god's turning over in his sleep, and the Samoans, when the soil trembled, gnawed the ground and prayed to the god Mafui to stop, lest he should shake the planet to pieces. Almost everywhere the earth was the great mother. Our language, which is often the precipitate of primitive or unconscious beliefs, suggests to this day a kinship between matter, materia, and mother, mater. Ishtar and Cybele, Demeter and Ceres, Aphrodite and Venus and Freya, these are comparatively late forms of the ancient goddesses of the earth, whose fertility constituted the bounty of the fields. Their birth and marriage, their death and triumphant resurrection were conceived as the symbols or causes of the sprouting, the decay, and the vernal renewal of all vegetation. These deities revealed by their gender the primitive association of agriculture with woman. When agriculture became the dominant mode of human life, the vegetation goddesses reigned supreme. Most early gods were of the gentler sex. They were superseded by male deities, presumably as a heavenly reflex of the victorious patriarchal family. Just as the profound poetry of the primitive mind sees a secret divinity in the growth of a tree, So it sees a supernatural agency in the conception or birth of a child. The savage does not know anything about the ovum or the sperm. He sees only the external structures involved and deifies them. They too have spirits in them and must be worshipped, for are not these mysteriously creative powers the most marvelous of all? In them, even more than in the soil, the miracle of fertility and growth appears. Therefore they must be the most direct embodiments of the divine potency. Nearly all ancient peoples worshipped sex in some form and ritual, and not the lowest people but the highest expressed their worship most completely. We shall find such worship in Egypt and India, Babylonia and Assyria, Greece and Rome. The sexual character and functions of primitive deities were held in high regard, not through any obscenity of mind, but through a passion for fertility in women and in the earth. Certain animals, like the bull and the snake, were worshipped as apparently possessing or symbolizing, in a high degree, the divine power of reproduction. The snake in the story of Eden is doubtless a phallic symbol, representing sex as the origin of evil, suggesting sexual awakening as the beginning of the knowledge of good and evil, and perhaps insinuating a certain proverbial connection between mental innocence and bliss. There is hardly an animal in nature, from the Egyptian scarab to the Hindu elephant, that has not somewhere been worshipped as a god. The Ojibwa Indians gave the name of totem to their special sacred animal, to the clan that worshipped it, and to any member of the clan. And this confused word has stumbled into anthropology as totemism, denoting vaguely any worship of a particular object, usually an animal or a plant, as especially sacred to a group. Varieties of totemism have been found scattered over apparently unconnected regions of the earth, from the Indian tribes of North America to the natives of Africa, the Dravidians of India, and the tribes of Australia. The totem as a religious object helped to unify the tribe, whose members thought themselves bound up with it or descended from it. The Iroquois, in semi-Darwinian fashion, believed that they were sprung from the primeval mating of women with bears, wolves, and deer. The totem, as object or as symbol, became a useful sign of relationship and distinction for primitive peoples, and lapsed in the course of secularization into a mascot or emblem, like the lion or eagle of nations, the elk or moose of our fraternal orders, and those dumb animals that are used to represent the elephantine immobility and mulish obstreperousness of our political parties. The dove, the fish, and the lamb, in the symbolism of nascent Christianity, were relics of totemic adoration. Even the lowly pig was once a totem of prehistoric Jews. In most cases, the totem animal was taboo, that is, forbidden, not to be touched. Under certain circumstances it might be eaten, but only as a religious act, amounting to the ritual eating of the god. Freud, with characteristic imaginativeness, believes that the totem was a transfigured symbol of the Father, revered and hated for his omnipotence, and rebelliously murdered and eaten by his sons. Durkheim thought that the totem was a symbol of the clan, revered and hated, hence held sacred and unclean, by the individual for its omnipotence and irksome dictatorship, and that the religious attitude was originally the feeling of the individual toward the authoritarian group. The Gallas of Abyssinia ate in solemn ceremony the fish that they worshipped, and said, "We feel the Spirit moving within us as we eat." The good missionaries who preached the gospel to the Gallas were shocked to find among these simple folk a ritual so strangely similar to the central ceremony of the Mass. Probably fear was the origin of totemism, as of so many cults. Men prayed to animals because the animals were powerful and had to be appeased. As hunting cleared the woods of the beasts and gave way to the comparative security of agricultural life, the worship of animals declined, though it never quite disappeared. And the ferocity of the first human gods was probably carried over from the animal deities whom they replaced. The transition is visible in those famous stories of metamorphoses, or changes of form, that are found in the Ovids of all languages, and tell how gods had been or had become animals. Later the animal qualities adhered to them obstinately, as the odor of the stable might loyally attend some rural Casanova. Even in the complex mind of Homer, Glaucopus Athene had the eyes of an owl, and Heriboapis had the eyes of a cow. Egyptian and Babylonian gods or ogres with the face of a human being and the body of a beast reveal the same transition and make the same confession, that many human gods were once animal deities. Most human gods, however, seem to have been in the beginning merely idealized dead men. The appearance of the dead in dreams was enough to establish the worship of the dead, for worship, if not the child, is at least the brother of fear. Men who had been powerful during life and therefore had been feared were especially likely to be worshipped after their death. Among several primitive peoples, the word for God actually meant a dead man. Even today, the English word spirit and the German word Geist mean both ghost and soul. The Greeks invoked their dead precisely as the Christians were to invoke the saints. So strong was the belief, first generated in dreams, in the continued life of the dead, that primitive men sometimes sent messages to them in the most literal way. In one tribe, the chief, to convey such a letter, recited it verbally to a slave and then cut off his head for special delivery. If the chief forgot something, he sent another decapitated slave as a postscript. Gradually, the cult of the ghost became the worship of ancestors. All the dead were feared and had to be propitiated lest they should curse and blight the lives of the living. This ancestor worship was so well adapted to promote social authority and continuity, conservatism and order that it soon spread to every region of the earth. It flourished in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and survives vigorously in China and Japan today. Many peoples worship ancestors but no God. Relics of ancestor worship may be found among ourselves in our care and visitation of graves and our masses and prayers for the dead. The institution held the family powerfully together despite the hostility of successive generations and provided an invisible structure for many early societies. And just as compulsion grew into conscience, so fear graduated into love. The ritual of ancestor worship, probably generated by terror, later aroused the sentiment of awe and finally developed piety and devotion. It is the tendency of gods to begin as ogres and to end as loving fathers. The idol passes into an ideal, as the growing security, peacefulness, and moral sense of the worshippers pacify and transform the features of their once ferocious deities. The slow progress of civilization is reflected in the tardy amiability of the gods. The idea of a human god was a late step in a long development. It was slowly differentiated through many stages out of the conception of an ocean or multitude of spirits and ghosts surrounding and inhabiting everything. From the fear and worship of vague and formless spirits, men seem to have passed to adoration of celestial, vegetative, and sexual powers, then to reverence for animals and worship of ancestors. The notion of God as Father was probably derived from ancestor worship. It meant originally that men had been physically begotten by the gods. In primitive theology, there is no sharp or generic distinction between gods and men. To the early Greeks, for example, their gods were ancestors, and their ancestors were gods. A further development came when, out of the medley of ancestors, certain men and women who had been especially distinguished were singled out for clearer deification. So the greater kings became gods, sometimes even before their death. But with this development, we reached the historic civilizations. 3. The methods of religion: magic, vegetation rites, festivals of license, myths of the resurrected God, magic and superstition, magic and science, priests. Having conceived a world of spirits whose nature and intent were unknown to him, primitive man sought to propitiate them and to enlist them in his aid. Hence, to animism, which is the essence of primitive religion, was added magic, which is the soul of primitive ritual. The Polynesians recognized a very ocean of magic power, which they called mana. The magician, they thought, merely tapped this infinite supply of miraculous capacity. The methods by which the spirits, and later the gods, were suborned to human purposes were for the most part sympathetic magic. A desired action was suggested to the deities by a partial or imitative performance of the action by men. To make rain fall, some primitive magicians poured water out upon the ground, preferably from a tree. The Kaffirs, threatened by drought, asked a missionary to go into the fields with an opened umbrella. In Sumatra, a barren woman made an image of a child and held it in her lap, hoping thereby to become pregnant. In the Babar archipelago, the would-be mother fashioned a doll out of red cotton, pretended to suckle it, and repeated a magic formula. Then she sent word through the village that she was pregnant, and her friends came to congratulate her. Only a very obstinate reality could refuse to emulate this imagination. Among the Dayaks of Borneo, the magician, to ease the pains of a woman about to deliver, would go through the contortions of childbirth himself, as a magic suggestion to the fetus to come forth. Sometimes the magician slowly rolled a stone down his belly and dropped it to the ground in the hope that the backward child would imitate it. In the Middle Ages, a spell was cast upon an enemy by sticking pins into a waxen image of him. The Peruvian Indians burned people in effigy and called it burning the soul. Even the modern mob is not above such primitive magic. These methods of suggestion by example were applied especially to the fertilization of the soil. Zulu medicine men fried the genitals of a man who had died in full vigor, ground the mixture into a powder, and strewed it over the fields. Some peoples chose a king and queen of the May, or a Whitsun bridegroom and bride, and married them publicly so that the soil might take heed and flower forth. In certain localities the rite included the public consummation of the marriage, so that nature, though she might be nothing but a dull clod, would have no excuse for misunderstanding her duty. In Java, the peasants and their wives, to ensure the fertility of the rice fields, mated in the midst of them. For primitive men did not conceive the growth of the soil in terms of nitrogen. They thought of it, apparently without knowing of sex in plants, in the same terms as those whereby they interpreted the fruitfulness of woman. Our very terms recall their poetic faith. Festivals of promiscuity, coming in nearly all cases at the season of sowing, served partly as a moratorium on morals, recalling the comparative freedom of sex relations in earlier days, partly as a means of fertilizing the wives of sterile men, and partly as a ceremony of suggestion to the earth in spring to abandon her wintry reserve, accept the proffered seed, and prepare to deliver herself of a generous litter of food. Such festivals appear among a great number of nature peoples, but particularly among the Cameroons of the Congo, the Kaffirs, the Hottentots, and the Bantus. Their harvest festivals, says the Reverend H. Rowley of the Bantus, are akin in character to the feasts of Bacchus. It is impossible to witness them without being ashamed. Not only is full sexual license permitted to the neophytes, and indeed in most cases enjoined, but any visitor attending the festival is encouraged to indulge in licentiousness. Prostitution is freely indulged in, and adultery is not viewed with any sense of heinousness on account of the surroundings. No man attending the festival is allowed to have intercourse with his wife. Similar festivals appear in the historic civilizations, in the Bacchic celebrations of Greece, the Saturnalia of Rome, the Fête des Fous in medieval France, May Day in England, and the Carnival or Mardi Gras of contemporary ways. Here and there, as among the Pawnees and the Indians of Guayaquil, vegetation rites took on a less attractive form. A man, or in later and milder days an animal, was sacrificed to the earth at sowing time so that it might be fertilized by his blood. When the harvest came, it was interpreted as the resurrection of the dead man. The victim was given, before and after his death, the honors of a god. And from this origin arose, in 1,000 forms, the most universal myth of a god dying for his people and then returning triumphantly to life. Poetry embroidered magic and transformed it into theology. Solar myths mingled harmoniously with vegetation rites, and the legend of a god dying and reborn came to apply not only to the winter death and spring revival of the earth, but to the autumnal and vernal equinoxes and the waning and waxing of the day. For the coming of night was merely a part of this tragic drama. Daily the sun god was born and died. Every sunset was a crucifixion, and every sunrise was a resurrection. Human sacrifice, of which we have here but one of many varieties, seems to have been honored at some time or another by almost every people. On the island of Carolina, in the Gulf of Mexico, a great hollow metal statue of an old Mexican deity has been found, within which still lay the remains of human beings apparently burned to death as an offering to the god. Everyone knows of the Molochs to whom the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and occasionally other Semites offered human victims. In our own time, the custom has been practiced in Rhodesia. Probably it was bound up with cannibalism. Men thought that the gods had tastes like their own. As religious beliefs change more slowly than other creeds, and rites change more slowly than beliefs, this divine cannibalism survived after human cannibalism disappeared. Slowly, however, evolving morals changed even religious rites. The gods imitated the increasing gentleness of their worshippers and resigned themselves to accepting animal instead of human meat. A hind took the place of Iphigenia, and a ram was substituted for Abraham's son. In time, the gods did not receive even the animal. The priests liked savory food, ate all the edible parts of the sacrificial victim themselves, and offered upon the altar only the entrails and the bones. Since early man believed that he acquired the powers of whatever organism he consumed, he came naturally to the conception of eating the god. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1.